We're pleased to have with us here today Jakob Dall, Pamela Elizarraras, Acitores. Pardon me for my poor Spanish pronunciation there. I gave it a try. And Kiliii Yuyan. Kiliii is a former Zeke Award winner as well and a frequent guest on the SDN Speaker Series. And the moderator for today's program is Justin Dalaba. Climate change remains the greatest existential threat facing our planet, but it's just gotten a whole lot worse with Donald Trump decimating any policy of the US government to slow the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels, and he's also enhancing drilling for oil and mining of coal. He's also gutting federal support for research into climate change and ways to slow its course. But as with all things Donald Trump, there are brave people who advocate for a better future because there's no alternative for many communities throughout the world. We will be underwater, we will have catastrophic weather, and our communities will be destroyed by devastating fires. But there are solutions and there are people, no matter the circumstances, who will continue this struggle. And I look forward to hearing more about their work this afternoon. The moderator and curator for this panel is Justin Dalaba. Justin is a conservation photographer and videographer working to advance understanding of climate challenges and solutions in collaboration with researchers and indigenous partners across the Northeast US. Originally trained as a conservation biologist, he embraced visual storytelling to share impactful stories that inspire change. While pursuing his master's in multimedia communications at the Newhouse School in Syracuse, New York, he became the first recipient of the Alexia Student Conservation Grant. Now let me turn this over to Justin.
Thanks, Glenn, for the welcome and introduction, and welcome everyone. I wanted to say thank you for showing up, not just in this space, but in this moment, at a moment when for some it feels easier to disengage than to show up. We recognize that conversations around climate change can feel heavy and intangible, especially when they touch on loss, injustice, and deep uncertainty. So I think it's important to take a moment to acknowledge the world we're stepping into this conversation from. We're living through a time when environmental challenges feel more charged, more polarized, and frankly, more personal than ever. There's a lot of noise, division, and people carrying real weight on their shoulders. But stories have always been how we remember who we are, how we bridge divides, how we show the truth, and how we imagine what's possible. So today, as we share and listen, I invite all of us to hold space for the complexity of this moment and to remember that storytelling is not just an escape from reality. It's a way of engaging more deeply with it. So let's get into it with open hearts, minds, and a respect for every voice in this room. Today, we'll witness the power of storytelling through images, voices, and lived experiences. This panel features photographers who are not just documenting climate change from afar, but who are working on the front lines, shoulder to shoulder, with impacted and marginalized communities. These are stories we don't always see, ones that challenge dominant narratives, center traditional knowledge, and remind us that climate challenges are inseparable from social issues. I'm really excited to be joined today by three world-renowned explorers and documentary photographers, each offering a unique perspective on the urgent environmental challenges that we face across continents and cultures. Today, we'll explore profound social and cultural impacts of climate change, sharing insights into their work with scientists, indigenous leaders, NGOs, and helping to foster awareness and to drive change. So as Glenn mentioned, our panelists today are Jakob Dall, who is an award-winning photojournalist joining us from Denmark. And we're also joined by Pamela Elizarraras Acitores, a documentary photographer from Mexico and founder of Climate Words and Latinas for Climate. And then finally, we'll hear from Kiliii Yuyan, who is a photographer of Chinese and Nanai descent, whose work for National Geographic and other major publications have taken him to the Arctic and beyond. Kilii's not with us yet, but he'll be joining at the end of our presentations here. He'll be our third speaker. So before we dive in, I just wanted to lay out, so over the next hour in a half, we'll just ask that you share questions as they come up in the chat, and we'll try to take one or two at the end of each presentation, which should be around 15 to 20 minutes each. And then once each speaker is finished, we'll have an open Q&A discussion where you're welcome to come on screen if you're comfortable, raise your hand and ask a question in person, or you can type those in the chat and we'll field those. So with that, I am excited to introduce our first speaker, Jakob Dall, who's an award-winning photojournalist whose work has taken him to some of the most vulnerable places on Earth. From conflict zones to climate-impacted regions, Jakob's storytelling sheds light on the personal experiences of those affected by crises. His long-term project, Climate Change Documentary, focuses on how climate change reshapes the lives of individuals around the world. So, Jakob, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thanks a lot. It was a really nice introduction. I'm honored just to be a part of it and to share my knowledge about climate change and the impacts that I have seen. And I've started this project back in 2006 when it was the first time when I actually realized that climate change was happening here and now on a trip to Malawi, where I was actually making a book for the Red Cross organization about children's life in Malawi. And they told me all these things that I've been read in the UN reports about climate change and how it was going to be in the future and all this, but they were already happening in Malawi. And for me, that started the project. And I've worked as a documentary photographer for, yeah, many years, nearly 30 years. I've started working with the Red Cross in 1998, and that's a long time ago. And I've documented both other catastrophes as well, and just came back from Ukraine. But my focus has always been on climate change impact because I see it as the biggest challenge for humanity. And when I see and meet people that really suffers of the climate change impacts, it's interesting to document and tell their stories. And that's why I want to share you some of my images. And I will just do it here and then continue talking. And let me see. This is it. And then slideshare. Then this should be starting. I hope you see images now. In a moment, I need to say share.
Yeah, we're not seeing it yet, Jakob.
I just need to put it down to share. So sorry, it came a little too fast. Share. There you go. You see anything now?
Yes, we're seeing your screen. That looks good. And
then I have slideshare start. Okay.
perfect.
I I started the project as well to learn about where was people suffering the most, where was the impacts the hardest, and where was it actually visible to see how climate change was already acting. And Bangladesh, where this picture was taken, is one of the most uh, vulnerable places on Earth to climate change, and especially in this area where it's the water is simply continuing rising, and salt is coming in from the ocean and destroying their crops. And this place where Ruhul, the old man, was going out to his little water pump that is out in the middle of this flood area. He goes there every day to collect water. And this is half a year after the disaster actually happened. So for me, it was important to tell what continues the problem and what continues the issues after a disaster. How does it affects people's life? And this used to be his rice field where he grew his rice and had something to live off. And unfortunately, that's what I often meet. And when I meet a young girl like Hadija sitting crying on Eid, she told me that she and her family lost everything during the flood. And normally she would get a new pair of clothes each year on this day. But the family couldn't afford because they have lost everything. And that was half a year after the disaster. And I didn't find any NGOs working there. There was like tarpaulins, like you can see from the UN, the blue ones in the background and so on. But people were starting building their own islands. And the really sad story about this is that what happened? You still see my pictures? No. Share. I don't know why share didn't come up. Share. Sorry.
Well, we're just seeing the thumbnails if you go into slideshow again.
Okay, I think I pushed something wrong. So I'll just do like this. You see the pictures now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that looks good.
Good. But the sad story about Bangladesh is that I actually returned last year. I don't know who is changing this because I'm not touching anything, but it seems like somebody's
Is it on a
changing.
timer or something?
No, it's not on a timer. But the thing is that that Bangladesh is still suffering from this flood because of all the salt and how it actually destroyed their crops and destroyed the land. And other places like this is from Ethiopia. They are suffering from continuously droughts in areas, and many of the areas that I actually has visited in this book, they already locally have more than +2 degrees. And for me, that was interesting also to do because that was what the Paris Agreement said was we are hoping for 1.5 degrees, which is only political because that was could be could be argued about, and hopefully they could reach that point. But my book is called +2 degrees because I don't believe that 1.5 that we have already passed that point. And if you see here in Ethiopia, in the places where I was back in the days where I started this, it's simply continues changing this one. Sorry about it. I don't know why it stops, but people need to take their guns with them when they are like watering their camels and so on, and that's because people are fighting over water, and people are coming from other clans and simply try to take over the water sources. And Rukija, that is this 80 years old blind woman that I met in a tent with 88,000 other IDPs. And she was simply suffering and nobody really helped her. And for me, that's what climate change is about, is that the resources, oh, it seems like every time somebody admits, it's every time somebody new
Wow.
comes into to the to the show, that's when I lose contact. When a
Jacob,
new
I
one.
have your images queued up on my computer. Would it be better
Okay,
if I shared them and you just tell me when to advance them?
yes. Simply just share them. That would be nice. And then I could continue speaking. But I'll tell you, I made this book +2 degrees while we're waiting for Glenn to share them. So it's about all the 18 different countries that I visited that are some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change impacts. And for me, photographing and coming and showing people's life is important because climate change, if you have to understand it, you also have to understand the feelings of it. And and we can just go to the next one because that is from Germany. And that is simply after the flood, and how that was a devastating flood 2 years ago in Europe. And that was when Europe really woke up because they really could see that you can go to the next. When I'll just do like next,
Yeah.
when I do like this, then you go to the next one. That people, they are like having, this could be a picture that could be recognized, but it could also have been from other parts of the world where it's like the devastation of simply after a flood. So, but to see something that you could really identify yourself with, and I know you have had many climate impact catastrophes in the US during the years, and you have seen tons of these images. But we can just, for me, it's also about the beauty and how to tell simple stories. And this is a picture of Muhammad from Iraq, in the north of Iraq, and I was there during a drought. And it's simply they have losing water in an amount that is so big that one of the biggest rivers from the Bible simply has lost 73% of the water during the last years. So as you see the water stand, it looks like some of the images I've taken in California during the drought in 2015, where you can see the bare landscape of where the water stand used to be. And this island with the little old building there hasn't been shown for more than 25 years. But the impact of climate change is so big that when you look at the the yield of the crops, it has gone down 75% in some areas, and that will become a bigger and bigger issue. And if we go to this is from the drought in 2011 in African Horn, and people was walking for more than 10 hours to fetch water on camelbacks. And on now they only had the donkeys, and what you actually see is a camel lying dead in just in the sand. And it was not only the animals that was dying, but it was also people dying because of the drought. And for me to sit there and be a part of it is to see actually like young boys, like this boy, Akuta, he was laying there on the ground and he was starving. And luckily for me and luckily for them, I had a four-wheel drive with me when I found them in the middle of the desert, because I saw there was some people standing in a place where there shouldn't be people under that tree because it was in the middle of a desert. So, and I went there and I saw that more than 50 people needed aid, and I could water and healthcare from doctors. So I drove 3 hours to find rescue for them with the Red Cross, and got them to come back in the day after and give them medicine and so on so they could survive. And she's just living on the front line of climate change, where actually her brother was killed because of the access to resources in on the ground. And many of the places I visit, I tried and hoped that I could visit, like here in Mali. I was going there actually to cover some floods, but flood wasn't near. It hasn't been raining, and this used to be a river. So for me, climate and continuing to see climate and how it impacts is so devastating, but it's also important that other photographers simply continue to tell their stories, because many of these places I have never met any other photographers, any other journalists on my trips. I've only been out in the middle of nowhere where it's people that are suffering the most. And I do that by working a lot with NGOs, but also by getting funds from different foundations and so on, so I can go out and travel and actually meet people where it's the worst in the situation. And it's not a drone photo, but it's actually taken out of World Food Program helicopter delivering food for victims of flood in Pakistan. That was an area that was nearly the size of Denmark that was flooded. And it's still like it leaves only it only leaves a lot of people suffering. It leaves a lot of if you take the next picture, it leaves like a half a meter of soil on above the where this used to be like green rice fields, and it's just like half a meter of soil that cannot be used but has to be removed before you can go down to fertile soil. And the problem is that other places like South Sudan, the youngest country in the world, it's like there are some places where they are rich in having a lot of oil, but other places, in the middle of the country. People are suffering so much, and it's like nearly 2 degrees warmer in South Sudan than it used to be. And it has gone during the last 20 years. The temperature has simply rise in a level where we can't follow. And she's picking up the leaves. That's all she has to offer her children to eat. And and other places, I don't know how many minutes, 2 minutes, minute more. I'll
We've
just
got about
simply
4 minutes left. Yep.
4 minutes left. Okay. So from Uganda, where like for me, it's important also just to show the daily life is continuing. It's like this is simply flooded, but people are still going to work, and other men are trying to fish there. And the bad thing about disasters is also that medical help is an issue because nobody can reach medical help during a disaster. And this is a picture of Beatrice. She's pregnant and she really fears of giving birth. She's only 16 years old, and it's the child is not laying in right position, but they can't afford because of the climate change. Actually, they have lost all their food and they have starting burning their trees for making a little bit of money from the charcoal that they can produce. So they can't afford to go to healthcare because it's so far distance. And when you see climate change, when the impacts the food and so on, it has a bigger set of simply extra consequences for the people. And many of the places, people starting to break up stones, to simply smash them to small stones that they can sell for construction down by the roadside. And it's all done just by a hammer because this man, Justin, he didn't had any plants that he could live off anymore. The harvest failed once again because there was drought and drought year after year, and it has been worse and worse. And people, many places start only to break up bricks because there's not enough water for harvesting and to make anything grow. And when aid is dropping as well, it simply is devastating to see it and meet people like this. And I will just go to a few slides because this was from my first book about climate change and the consequences. And I'm actually, you can go 2 slides down. I'm trying to continue to do the next book about what kind of solutions are there. And this is like a modern water place where you could actually prevent it from bad water to come in. And this is one of the best projects I've ever seen. Like they are making holding the water back so they have a big lake when the harvest has failed and they can go and fish in that lake. And it provides food enough for 50,000 people in that lake. And it comes in turns from the judges, from the local chiefs in the area that decides who is going to fish now and so on. And we'll simply just take a few more pictures of solutions about keeping bees in the mangroves. People are, education is the most important actually, because people learn from education and trying to make money out of fishing, fishing farms for women and making small like greenhouses for people that has fled from the war in South Sudan. And we will just easily go over like starting to plant more seaweed in the ocean because it gives the opportunity that can be used both for soap and other things. And we just stand with the next one because I think we'll stop here because it's for me this is also hope. It's the hope for the future, and it is not my generation, unfortunately,
Or
that
my
will.
blooper reel.
But it's this women, it is children like her carrying a tree to the school to be sure that it is getting water and it will grow faster and will grow bigger. And I hope for the future that that will give a good example that they are learning about and getting the knowledge of the environment and taking care about plants because that's so important.
Perfect. Thank you, Jacob. Right on time and super powerful, moving, emotional images. I wanted to just emphasize a key point you touched on, which is making sure people see something that they identify with. And I think so often we can feel far removed and tune out to the harm and destruction that others face in their daily lives. But when we see a little bit of ourselves or something familiar in a story, then we can feel that more deeply. We are able to take, I think, one quick question, and I see there's one in the chat from Jennifer, who asked, they are just starting out their journey in climate photography and wonders how you find willing subjects or participants.
Um, I've only, I think, twice met that I was not allowed to take a picture of somebody that is suffering from climate change impacts. And both times was in California. And for me, when I travel around, and if you meet people and actually tell them what you are coming for and what kind of story that you want to tell, it's much easier to get the access. And often, if I see a good picture and I think that this could be a big deeper, I will meet people, I will talk to them, I will. I will simply continue talking to them to find out, is there a good story here? And if there is a good story, then I always ask if I can come back tomorrow or follow them home or continue what they're doing. Maybe I met them by the water pond or like fetching water or something, and then I'll follow with them home, and it will give me a lot more options. But it's always good to have the access and find out if people are willing and for your story. And I always think that people are willing if they want to. A lot of people want to share their stories, and they want to share their stories because for this it's a matter of their life. It's they are they are fighting for the daily life. And they, of course, want to tell you that story. And for me, that's the open mind for me to go and talk to people and then follow them.
Excellent. Thanks for your perspective on that, Jacob. And I think we need to move on just to keep on time here. But for those who are still typing questions in the chat, we'll circle back to those in our discussion at the end. So next up, we have Pamela, who is a documentary photographer from Mexico, and her work combines climate justice and gender equality issues. She's a member of the Explorers Club, Protect Our Winters, and Arctic Angels, and is a local Arcturix ambassador. As a founder of Climate Words and Latinas for Climate, Pamela's advocacy empowers communities and inspires action through a unique approach to visual storytelling. She blends design thinking with photojournalism, emphasizing the need for climate optimism and collective action. So, Pamela, are you ready to cue up your slides?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming and for engaging in those topics. And also thank you, Glenn and Justin, for having me here. I'm excited to be in conversation with Jacob and Kiliii. Today, I'm going to be sharing 3 projects. Some are completed, others still in progress. And they mostly explore different ways of telling climate stories while collaborating with communities on the front lines and also those actively working on solutions. Today, the solutions are mostly centered around the international space, particularly the UN negotiations that are happening around the Paris Agreement. I'll share my screen. So over the past 8 years, I've been focusing on documenting the youth-led climate justice movement. It started in New York City where I noticed that after um I noticed that there were only certain media presence where famous activists were in town. And otherwise, the kids who were skipping school every Friday and going in front of the UN wouldn't be getting any attention unless those famous people were there. And I, as someone from their generation and someone who is was basically born at a time where the climate crisis was already a reality, I felt very aligned with all the things they were asking for, mostly for New York City in this photo to declare a climate emergency. Um, all the all the nonviolent direct action were creating momentum for the United Nations climate conference. At that time was COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, but I'll get there in a bit. These are another photos from 2018 with high school students skipping Fridays and drafting letters for the city council and going in person to hand them to the representatives. They again were asking the city to declare a climate emergency. And when I say declare a climate emergency, is for once that is declared, it would help the city um in enact solutions more easily. So a transition into renewable energies, more public transport, and also adapting to the effects of climate change like floods, hurricanes, etc., things that are already a thing here in New York. This is also another action that was happening. These two photographs were part of the protest that broke world records. And it happened in September, I believe, of 2018. And it was a time where a lot of kids around the world were just asking their governments to take real action and increase their ambition. And then the pandemic arrived and it kind of shattered all our hopes and optimism. During lockdown, I reached out to youth activists from around the world, people involved in all kinds of organizations and movements. Many I had worked already in person in New York, and others I had just met online. I wanted to hear how their activism had shifted and how 2020 was the year where they were now behind a screen, but yet hoping for the ambition that we had been building up to in these past year and a half, 2 years. Each portrait was paired with an environmental image that reflected their work. So for example, here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is Daniela. She's an environmental defender in Colombia, in the Sierra Nevada. And this was a photograph that I took in Mexico, in the Lacandon jungle. So we tried to fit as much of their work as possible to the portrait while I had interviews with them to better understand what they were doing, what kind of work they were involved in their community. And that was a series of 21 youth activists. And I'll just pause for a bit in case you want to read. And the way I guess the series was taken was through Zoom interviews and then projecting the visuals into my room to kind of share and to share what lockdown had been for them, but also for me as someone who had spent the last 2 years documenting protests and strikes and those kids outside the UN. Suddenly we were all back in our rooms. The project was exhibited outside of the United Nations negotiation spaces in Glasgow. It's called the Blue Zone for those who are familiar with the negotiations, but only people who are negotiating are allowed. So only presidents and negotiators. It's a very strict place, but many of the people there are older than 50. So not a lot of people from our generation, which for a lot of us is a harsh reality because, again, as Jakob mentioned earlier, the climate crisis is something that is going to affect our generation the most and those who are coming. Yet we don't really have a say in what is happening or what can happen. This is an image of the negotiation exhibit, and just to note, out of the 21 youth participating in this series, only 7 were allowed inside the negotiation space in that year. And those were already 21 people who were incredibly involved in getting their countries to take climate action in communities. So yeah, it's a very low number. Inside these spaces, I've been continuing to document these people, and many times it's a place where there's not a lot of joy. I think we all do our work through radical optimism, just finding like the last drop of that optimism to keep on doing the work and keep on showing up to demand a just future for us and future generations. And just to note that during these negotiations, there's a lot of people who are talking this UN language or this fancy language where there's a lot of acronyms, but also a lot of terms that not a lot of people understand. A lot of the words are stuck in its science and policy niches. Many people, especially outside the United Nations, don't understand anything at all, but also inside the negotiation spaces. It's language that it's not very clear. So noticing that, I found that climate literacy is incredibly correlated with climate action. And the more people talk about it, the more likely they are to take action. So in this conference, I was doing my master's in photojournalism and decided to kind of test what climate words would be or what it is now as a thesis project. But to go into these photos, this was a COP26, and it was one of the first negotiations without formal fossil fuel presence. And in this image, this was an event of BP and Gazprom. Somehow they managed to host a panel discussion inside the conference, and this young activist was able to get in and show them that we are there, we are watching, by drawing ice on her hands. Again, don't know how familiar y'all are with the UN space and rules, but you're not allowed to blame anyone. So it's a very hard and fine line to navigate. And this was one of the few ways she could kind of hold them accountable, them being the fossil fuel industry. This is another example. This is when Emiliana, a Colombian activist, made an intervention after repeatedly asking the Colombian government to meet with them. The reason why they wanted to meet with them is because Colombia had been ignoring the calls for ratifying the Escazú Agreement. For those who don't know what the Escazú Agreement is, it's basically the equivalent of the Paris Agreement for Latin America and the Caribbean, but it has a portion that protects environmental defenders. So it's kind of like where the environmental space and human rights come together. So this was an intervention where she heard that her president was going to be showing off how Colombia was a leader in the environmental space, yet it was in reality the deadliest country for environmental defenders, especially that year. A report before the conference came out, like noting that Colombia had been #1. So she managed to get in and ask the president why he hadn't signed the agreement. And a year later, Colombia actually signed the agreement. So this intervention helped her get into contact with the people that were ignoring her. So going back to climate literacy, climate literacy is actually super important, and not a lot of schools talk enough about it. It is 3 times more likely to someone who knows enough about climate change is more than 3 times as likely to take real action. So do something in their community or in their industry. And this, again, another protest in New York City. Jerome Foster, I don't know if anyone knows him, but he works inside the White House. Actually worked, not anymore that Trump is elected. But yes, just a lot of young kids that managed to get into the spaces that they were once protesting outside of. And going into climate words, which is kind of the work I'm doing now in a multimedia format, we're a team of 21 people from 12 countries working together in a sociocratic system. Combining our unique skills, we collaborate with global leaders, scientists, indigenous communities, and artists to build a community focused on sharing knowledge and optimism, using language, storytelling, and visuals to drive climate action. So we're not only looking hyper specifically to the words and the language, we also look into visuals and stories that are passed on through generations. This summer, I went to the Greenlandic and Canadian High Arctic with the Explorers Club and Adventure Canada, where I collaborated with Inuit cultural educators, scientists, historians, and artists to articulate the Arctic's deep interconnectedness with the rest of the world. The heart of the project was showing truly the interconnections with the high north and the south, or all corners of the world, the changes that are already affecting people and far beyond it. While I was there, I focused especially on aspects of resilience and adaptation, stories that mirror what many frontline communities are experiencing globally, similar to the ones Jakob was showing. These are just examples. It was in the summer, so obviously not as much ice, but it was a pretty iceless summer, where even the few ice that usually was not there. This is a cultural performance that elders and the young generation were working on. And it's a program that connects elders with youth to continue traditions and traditions, and I'm missing the word. Let's just keep it at traditions. But yeah, it has actually brought, despite just keeping the traditions alive, it has brought the community together, and it was very cool to witness. This is part of the same program. They were running to get one of the other girls to come join the community center.
Hey, Pamela, just to let you know, if you could wrap this up in a minute or so, to keep things on time, will be great. Thanks.
That was it. That's the last slide.
Okay. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, I appreciate your collaborative approach, especially when I think so many people see photography as really an individualistic effort, but it's really the organizations and the communities you surround yourself with that make the work all the more impactful. So thanks for that. And just to keep on time here, I see there is a question for you in the chat, Pamela. Maybe if you want to respond to that, and then we can get to more in the end, our Q&A session. But I wanted to move on to our last but not least final speaker, Kiliii Yuyan. He's a photographer of Chinese and Nanai descent, whose work for National Geographic and other publications have taken him to the Arctic and beyond, really immersing himself in both the wilderness and in indigenous cultures. Kilii's storytelling has earned him numerous accolades, including the prestigious National Geographic Eliza Skidmore Award for Outstanding Storytelling. And Kiliii, I see you've joined us here. Are you ready to share some images with us?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Hey, fantastic. Well, Batsugwapo, Hisengoro si Kili. Hi, everyone. My name is Kili, and welcome. Let's do this. Right, how's that look?
Excellent.
Okay. Well, I'm a storyteller, so I have to start with the story. And on one gorgeous day in the Arctic, on a clear, sunny afternoon in the crisp air of a frozen lagoon, it's me and my friend Will, and we are on an adventure near the Alaskan village of Kotzebue, and we are searching for the elusive muskox. But we are on a budget, right, as it is always these days, and we need snow machines, snowmobiles to travel the distance, but they cost $600 a day to hire. So my photo editor, Will, is going to have to ride behind me in the behind the snowmobile in the sled with all the equipment. So we make it sound nice and call it his Arctic rite of passage. And we're coming here to Kotzebue at the very beginning of spring in April, and typically it's still pretty darn cold, usually around -10 degrees Fahrenheit at night. And so Will and I drive up the frozen rivers to approach the hills where the muskox live. And you know, in the far north, rivers are the highways, right? This is the only time of year when we can get around easily. So we go up the Noatak River, and by the early afternoon, we've made a great distance, but the frozen crust over the snow has softened, and the snowmobile gets stuck as it breaks through and plunges into the deep snow. So I noticed, like, gosh, it seems really unusually warm. And so I check the thermometer in my backpack, and it says 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the machine is stuck and everything is melting around us. And so we dig and we dig and we dig. And finally, we get the snowmobile free. We turn it around and come down the hill, and we decide, okay, well, we're going to get stuck here. Let's go back, at least to a place that's flat. And so I drive down the hill back onto the river. And as I'm coming down, going slow, maybe 15 miles an hour, all of a sudden, my spider senses tingle and they tell me something is wrong. And every bone in my body wants to change direction right then. And so I crank the snowmobile to the right, knowing that I'm going to get crushed under it. And the machine turns violently and topples onto me. But out of my peripheral vision, I can see the sled break off at the hitch, and it sails out onto the river. And a few moments later, when I push the snow machine off of me and look out over the river, it's a terrifying sight. It's rotten ice, or a darkened patch of ice signaling that it's going to collapse very soon. And right next to that darkened patch of ice is a crack that is getting larger as we speak, and Will is staring at me with very, very large eyes. So Will takes a deep breath, and then he inches slowly and pushes the sled with his hands to each side of him. It just sort of scooches on his butt. And the water, which is flooding in through the crack, seeping out onto the snow and is coming up faster than Will is moving. But somehow he gets close enough to the bank to jump out. And I take a huge sigh of relief because I won't have to tell his wife, Erin, that I've killed her brand new husband. So the first time I ever told this story, Will and Erin were actually in the audience during this big presentation that I was making, and she ran up to me immediately afterward and she said, "Hey, that is not the story you guys told me when you first came back." I was like, what do you mean? But you know, In the end, we couldn't stay there in Alaska and risk our lives any longer. A few days later, we've gotten back to Seattle, and I called off the shoot and I said, and then I got the news that several local Yupik who had been traveling on the same river broke through that river and died. On their own river, in their own traditional territory, something had changed about the place, about the snow, about the ice. Climate change had come for all of us. In my 30s, I became a National Geographic photographer, and I pitched stories that took me to indigenous communities around the world. And I began to see that there was a powerful link between the world's beautiful places and the people that live in them. And in fact, Native communities have territories that comprise about 40% of all the remaining land, and much of the world's forests, sequestering the world's carbon. And I want to start at a place in the Pacific in the island nation of Palau. So the coral reefs of Palau have the highest biodiversity among the world's seas, and they're also among the most resilient to climate change, right? So the Scripps Oceanographic Institute tracked changes to the coral and actually found that Palauan reefs actually recover from coral bleaching amazingly quickly. Why? Because of great numbers of healthy fish. Now, the reasons for that are complicated, but you can ask me later. And that includes these young reef sharks who are living in the protection of this mangrove lagoon. The indigenous Palauans were the first ones to, made history because they were the first ones to declare their waters a sanctuary for sharks. At that time, people were like, what? What are you talking about, sanctuary for sharks? But that they valued sharks. And I want to move on to the world's oldest rainforest, Australia's wet tropics. And so what's weird is that in this UNESCO World Heritage Site, which has been government protected for decades, biodiversity is actually falling. The wet tropics was once a quilt of different ecosystems, from rainforests to meadows to mangroves. But without human intervention, mature rainforest actually takes over those different ecotypes and decreases the biodiversity there. And that includes the decline of these crazy Muppet velociraptors, the cassowaries. They are a keystone species, essentially essential workers, right? Because they eat and poop out the seeds of rainforest plants. And without them, 150 species of rainforest plants wouldn't be able to propagate. But like the cassowaries, humans are also essential to the health of the forest. The wet tropics are the homelands of the Jabugai people who've been here for as long as 60,000 years. And during that time, they shaped the landscape around them using fire, but a particular kind of fire that we call cultural fire. And one of those cultural burning experts is Ranger Damien Hunter of the Jabugai. And he works here, and his fires aren't the raging wildfires you see in the news. Those burns arise during hot, windy weather, and they put tons of carbon into the atmosphere, right? But Damien waits until the forest and the soil underneath it is moist. So the cool, slow fires like his actually creep around and burn up all the leaf litter like little Roombas roaming the woods. And when Europeans came to Australia in the late 1700s, they saw fire as a destructive force. And so they banned indigenous fire and then jailed indigenous people for burning the forest in the ways that they didn't really understand. And so those unfired lands grew thick with flammable brush, and species like the critically endangered Kuranda tree frog vanished. But then the raging wildfires started, right? Do you remember back in 2019 when there were all the pictures of the toasted koalas? By eliminating indigenous cultural burns, Australia had made hot burns basically inevitable. Climate change made it worse, but indigenous fire has returned. When I started this project, Guardians of Life, I didn't understand how it was that indigenous peoples have been able to steward their lands so effectively, right? I needed to go out into the real world and ask, why are indigenous communities so often so good at conservation? And the answer to that is this long mouthful, traditional ecological knowledge, also called TEK. Right, so TEK is the kind of knowledge that indigenous peoples acquire by living for centuries in a single place, right? And it's been crystallized into stories and songs. So TEK is about an entire community working together to monitor the world that they live in, the environment they live in, so that they can change how they manage it. And Palau's ancient system of fishery management is called BUL, or BUL. And this is how it works. So you get one day a chief hears from a fisherman, maybe their cousin, that there's not a lot of parrotfish left near a certain reef. And so the chief goes free diving and finds that, oh yeah, actually there's not a lot of parrotfish here. So the chief declares a bull and closes down one area of the reef and another one opens automatically. And that is how the health of the fishery is kept so healthy. This is similar to Western styles of conservation. And on the other side of the world, in Greenland, the traditional ecological knowledge is actually written down. It's very different than the Western style, but it's also considered the oldest written conservation law in the world. So to maintain populations of narwhals, for example, traditional knowledge said that Inuit, who are the people of North Greenland, must hunt traditionally in the calving areas by paddling out in kayaks by hand and harpooning narwhals by hand instead of using rifles, instead of using motorboats. And like the kayak, the dog sled is also critical to life up here in North Greenland. So Inuit depended on the Greenland sled dog for centuries, and sled dogs don't need to be barged in, right? They don't need fossil fuel to run. In North Greenland, it's the only breed of dog. They're actually still so similar to wolves that they can't even bark, but they growl and they howl in chorus, the background song of Greenland that I love. Personally, I love dog sledding on the ice, accompanied by the rhythmic whooshing of the dogs running. And this is a reminder of traditional life at its most vibrant, life lived in the now. And you're out there, you're immersed in the pale sights and quiet sounds, breathing in the crisp, cold air, punctuated by the occasional whiff of dog farts. So it's not exactly entirely emissions free. But indigenous peoples often fight for goals that will take decades to accomplish. And one such place is Northern California. Right? Enormous dams were built on the Klamath River in the early 1900s, and those dams blocked salmon and spread disease. And because the dams slowed the rivers in this increasingly hot climate, they created the ideal habitat for salmon-killing parasites. And that parasite just decimated the salmon population. So 10 years ago, Karuk tribal member Ron Reed and his friends would come down. They'd catch 20 salmon in a single day and then make the rounds through the Yurok and Karuk community, drop off fish for everybody. They had a lot of happy relatives, you know. But by 2020, they couldn't catch a single one all season. So 30 years ago, the Klamath people started suing the power companies and staging protests. That's 3 decades ago. They sent tribal members to Warren Buffett's annual shareholder meeting and shamed that billionaire into the biggest dam removal project in history. And by summer last year, every single one of those dams has come down. This is the Klamath River last August. When the last dam went down, the river returned to its original banks underneath all that water. Within months, the valley began to look like it had 150 years earlier. Another place where they look generations into the future is the Amazon. So the Amazon rainforest is, of course, the lungs of the planet, right? And one section in Ecuador is especially impressive. It is the homeland of the Kofan people. So Kofan lands have the highest biodiversity of any single place on Earth. And I spent a month here with Kofan leader Hugo Lucetante. So Hugo was sent away from his village when he was 10. He'd never left the rainforest before. But the elders who shipped him to Seattle gave him a mission to save his homeland. He would leave to gain a Western education, learn all the colonial languages, and return to fight for his people. And what Hugo learned to fight was the carbon industry. Beginning in the 1970s, oil companies began drilling, and the result was vast deforestation and pollution. But the Kofan fought that drilling extremely successfully for the next 50 years, aided by leaders like Hugo. And they were so successful that they became role models for the rest of Latin America. So today, we find ourselves at a critical moment. I don't have to tell you that. But you know, the cutting edge of conservation now realizes that the formula to protect a place and to protect the planet is not to evict its indigenous stewards from the land. Instead, people now understand that the most beautiful intact lands are beautiful because of their people. But I want you to hear from their voices directly. Mads Ole Christensen says, hunters are seeking balance. That is why we take care of our place. We are the balance. That is why we are hunters. Ranger Topsy Gibson of the Jabberguy says, cultural fire is a very big thing. Yeah, fire brings more wallabies down to the beach and other little creatures. It brings back that soft grass for them to eat. And Ugo says, if the world truly wants to protect its forests, then efforts like ours need to be recognized for what they are, the hard labor of people who must also feed their families and raise their children. And finally, we leave you with Lisa Hillman kissing her husband Leaf on the banks of the newly restored Klamath River. And she said to me, this land belongs to you. You belong to this land. So you have to care for it. Daniela, thank you very much.
Amazing, Kiliii. As always, super engaging and inspiring. And I really felt like I was there with you and hearing the voices of those people. So let's give all of our speakers a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so next we are going to dive into our Q&A discussion. And the way I'd like to kind of have this work is I want it to be conversational, so folks feel free to, raise your hand and chime in as questions come up or type them in the chat if you're more comfortable doing so. I did try to keep a log of everyone's questions as they were popping up. So what I'd like to do first is kind of ask a general question for each of you and have you kind of weigh in with your perspective. And then I'll move into the questions that others have shared throughout. And I'm going to go ahead and spotlight all of us so we can show up on everyone's screen here. Can you all see our panelists now? Excellent. Okay, so my first question for each of you is it's kind of twofold. As a visual storyteller, what do you hope your audience takes away from your projects on climate change? And then the second piece of that is how has your own perspective kind of evolved since you began on documenting these stories? And I'll go ahead and start with Jacob, and we'll just go in the order of our speakers if that works.
Well, thanks a lot. And it was really inspiring to hear the other panelists as well to talk about climate change and how they document it. But for me, it's very important for viewers actually to go in and listen to how people from other countries that I've met, how they actually explain how climate change is impacting them on their daily life. That now it's not just a matter of a small flood that has come, but it's a perspective has changed for them totally. That now it's a battle of life for them and not just everyday life is a battle and how that has changed for everybody. So when I show my pictures and when I talk, tell the stories from each one of the people I photographed, people they get engaged in it and they really turn it backwards to themselves and say, why haven't I seen that? Because the most common stories in newspapers that they read is, oh, there's a flood somewhere or there's a wildfire. And then they see a picture from above or from far distance where you can see a fire. But getting personal stories from people that are actually in the battlefield of climate change, where they suffer from climate impacts every day, that's where people are also being heard in their feelings. And that's the emotion I get back from my viewers.
Thanks, Jacob. Pamela, did you have thoughts on that?
Yes. Um, I think similar to Jacob, I am interested in viewers seeing how climate change is impacting them at their local level, but also what they can do about it. I think the way I hope the audience sees it is how can they be engaged citizens, whether it's their super local level in their own town city or going higher international levels. There are so many climate solutions that I think there's always optimism, even if things are ugly.
Yeah, those are great answers. Yeah, I appreciate this idea of being on the ground level and looking at the way that people are living on the ground level. For me, if they, I mean, the wonderful thing about photography is that people are able to take away what they see. They don't necessarily have to have their own our interpretation on it. But I think if there was going to be a single takeaway from the kind of work that it is that I do, which is primarily on solutions, on very solutions oriented, I would say that it is that there is no one right way to live. And that's sort of at the heart of the climate story and the conservation story. Someone one time very astutely noted to me, like, humanity has a bit of a self-esteem problem. Like, people think that humans, like, inherently will always destroy the natural world. But you only have to really just like think about that for a second to realize that it's not true. Humans have been around for 300,000 years. And that when you look around the different cultures of the world, if you count it by distinct cultures rather than by population, you'll see that there are more indigenous communities than any other types of human communities in the world, and that by and large they live in ways that is making the land and the place that they live in better, not worse. And so that is the dominant way that human beings culturally live in this place. And so to recognize that there isn't just one right way to live, and to see that there's so many different human ways of existing in the world that are still there, still humming along, gives me so much optimism. And that's hopefully the thing that it does that I want people to take away is not a sense of optimism, and also a sense of not looking for just solutions from within your own culture, but to look outside of what it is that we already, our own biases, to be able to see the bigger picture.
I love that. Thanks for all your perspectives on that. And I think Kiliii, just to kind of round out that thought, you really captured in a nutshell what photojournalism is about. It's about opening our hearts and minds to other worlds and ways of seeing. So well said. Um, Jacob, did you have a thought to chime in, or were you just
No, I think it's really well said. And I think that also when I'm working on solutions, it's like every time when I go out to places that has also met disasters and so on, people are simply trying to find new solutions on their daily life because it's the only way, and that's also giving hope. And I've seen some solutions, but then showing them on some of my exhibitions and talks and so on, and the Red Cross has actually implemented more of the solutions because I've shared the local small scale solutions to the Red Cross, and they have seen it, and now they implement it in other countries that have never thought about that. So it's also about sharing solutions, and that's very important in giving people hope that there is solutions. So that's really important to know.
absolutely? Um, I did want to ask a question that came up. This was for Keely, but I think it's a really big picture question for everyone to chime in, which is that, this field is notorious for barriers to entry, especially when you're traveling to these far off places. And so the question came up, how do you finance your first visit to a story before you're officially on assignment per se? And they added most of the stories are happening in places that are where access is quite expensive. So do you have thoughts to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, it is absolutely true that it is very expensive. And, I think that the number of these kinds of stories that are able to be done keeps decreasing. But at the same time, too, I also think that when you look around and see what's happening in the world, people are largely getting their information not through these sort of standard channels anymore anyway. They're learning things from someone who's local, who's on TikTok, from if they want to learn about Greenland, they'll find a Greenlander who's on TikTok and like talking about their life or whatever it is. And the unfortunate part about it is that sometimes it's really shallow. A lot of it is really shallow, right? Doesn't kind of have that sort of professional uh, training isn't the right word, but it's sort of like the amount of time and space to think about something from a really broad and also really close viewpoint. But I think that when you go like working in these places, it never starts by just going to some crazy place. You know, like you, almost every person, almost all of my colleagues that got started in this got started on in a way that where they were a specialist in something else. They had another reason to bring them to a place to see and understand something. And they became experts. They were already an expert in something else. Like traditional kayaks brought me to Alaska for the first time. I wasn't there to do photography. I was there because I was a kayak builder and I was sharing and learning cultural knowledge with Alaskans. And then I started to see what was happening up there. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I feel at home here. But you know what? It is, I think on some level, that part of it is really important because it's not just the notion of like dropping into all these different places, but that's something that you have. Look, the point of it is that if you're going to go to a place, is there some kind of special insight or special toolkit that you use that you bring that has the ability to actually tease something out that the world doesn't know or doesn't understand or is worth knowing about, you know? And that is the sort of intersection that you have to find. Every single person has to figure out that particular intersection of what you're good at, what you like to do, and what the world needs. Those three things are constantly in tension with each other. But when and what you're good at, what you have to contribute is one of the big ones. Like, you know, like quite a lot of the National Geographic photographers were biologists before they became photographers, and that's how they got to be so good at it, is because they learned to tell stories, but they were already experts in their fields. And so they were often in the field already. They knew a lot about those places. It wasn't their first visit to that particular place before on that, right? And so, and someone like, say, Jared Diamond, for example, who works in Papua New Guinea, you know, he was an ornithologist, you know, a bird biologist, and he learned about indigenous peoples because he spent a lot of time in Papua New Guinea and was starting to notice and have insights about the world around him. And I think that that's, in a way, that's sort of the best answer that I could give, which is that although everyone has to figure out how they make this thing happen for themselves, the answer isn't necessarily, I'm just going to find a bunch of money and that will solve my problem. I think the answer is actually how, as a human being, do I navigate this world in a way that fulfills my curiosity and is something that's really valuable, worth doing. You know, you navigate this person as the world as something full of curiosity, full of wonder, and full of passion, and hopefully it lines up with something that the rest of the world needs and is finds useful. And that's where the start comes. That's
Yeah,
why it's so hard.
exactly. And I think you said it well. And just to kind of encapsulate that, it's how do you add your piece to this broader conversation with what you already have access to? So yeah, well said. And Jacob or Pamela, did you have any thoughts to add on that?
Well, I could start. I think it's a really good answer, and but for me, it's often that I find like a small line in a report or from the UN or from other organizations, International Red Cross, CARE, whatever organization there is, and I find one line that saying mentions a small problem that I find, why haven't I heard about that before? I've been documenting climate change impacts since 2006, and I still wonder if there is some topics that could be interesting actually to tell about. And for me, it's also about returning to some of the places where I've been before. And I started in 2006 in Malawi, and I was back last year in Malawi, and I actually found the same family that I followed that time and heard about how changed things has changed for them. And there used to be a small river stream and so on, and now there's no more river, and they don't understand why isn't there any river? But they have simply cut down the trees because the droughts was coming more and more often. So they had to cut down the trees to sell charcoal. But if you go into stories where you have actually find access to, but you have to find it in a broader perspective and to find the story first, research, research, and research. And I do that a lot before I actually start funding, and then I start finding the money from foundations or talking to the NGOs that are working in the area, talking to experts in many ways. But and that way you get the more knowledge you get, the less you know, because it simply gives you more and more questions that you want to follow up on, and what kind of specific areas are there, and that's the way I'm working. And often I spend a lot of time with families. And in 2006, I was spending 1 week in one family home, and then the next week in another family home. And in that way, you become a part of the local community. And that's often how I work. I go really close and stay there for long. So people also have to be open to actually live in conditions that are hard, just under a blanket and a mosquito net, or if there's not any place to stay nearby.
Yeah, well said, both of you. And I just want to make a note. We won't have time to get to all of these questions. So maybe as we're responding, if you are keen on multitasking, feel free to kind of respond to some folks as questions are coming in the chat here. Um, but we'll take a couple more. And I wanted to ask, this is a big one. It's important to get to, I think, and this came up in Pamela's talk. So someone was asking if they could get your advice on how to remain safe and comfortable in the field when you're reporting in these spaces, especially as a young woman.
I think for me, what has worked the best so far has been building mutual trust with the people I'm collaborating with. So me trusting them enough to live with them for a few weeks or whatever, and for them to open their phones to me. And a lot of the times it's not also just about living with them, but it's about having that continuous conversation. For example, with the youth activists, we've traveled all around the world following the negotiations, and we've kind of made ourselves, or we've built enough trust within ourselves to create a network where we're each other's safety nets. So yeah, building trust has been what has made me feel safe. But I will say I have said no to a few projects where I don't feel safe going to. So it is something that I think as society, we're not there yet where women feel safe enough to do any kind of story.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts on that, Pamela. And I think it speaks to another question kind of more broadly, which is working. You made the point about, working with folks on the ground, building that trust. And so I wanted to ask about, for those of you who are working with guides or fixers, somebody asked, is someone helping you with translation when you're working across different countries? And could you maybe speak a little bit to that process of working with folks on the ground to build a story?
Well, I could start just this simple thing is that I always work together with interpreters and people that know the local society. So normally I try to find one that is as local as possible, that speaks quite a good English. And if I have problems with the English, I always record the conversation with a small mic, just so I can get it interpreted later on and be sure if the quote was right from the first time when you heard it. And in that way, it's important actually to have somebody that is really good. And I always say to people that are translating for me that they should not tell like, and that's it's so common that people they are simply saying, oh, she's saying this and this, but she's been speaking for 5 minutes, and it's like they're making it so short. And it's like you really have to say, you have to stop people talking and then simply translate exactly what they said, and that is really important. And it's also, if they know the society better, it gives you a better insight of the community.
Certainly. Any thoughts, Kiliii? Did you want to weigh in?
Um, yeah, if it's a place where I don't speak the language at all, which generally speaking, if I go to a place, I start learning the language immediately because I'm really interested in language. I'm terrible at it, but I love it. And one of the most important things to me is to learn how to pronounce things right away, quickly. Um, but if it's a place where I don't speak it very well, then I will definitely get an interpreter that I work with, or I will hire an assistant who is local to the community. And that's part of the reciprocity also, so that they get a chance, they're interested in media, so they get a chance to work with someone on assignment while also being useful as an interpreter. But it is really important to have an interpreter, but it is not always there are points on a project where, like, if you, for example, are trying to replace repeatedly, you don't always need an interpreter for every single last thing. And that gets to be very expensive and some also logistically very difficult sometimes. And it is important to know that I think that a lot of communication happens in a way that is not verbal. And and a big part of it is coming in with enough of the foreknowledge about the culture in the community to on enough familiarity. If it's like if it's your beat, it helps a lot. If it's something that you have some expertise in, it helps a lot because so much of what we learn as journalists on the ground comes from observation. You're watching over a long period of time something that's happening, and you're watching and you might not know how to interpret it, but if you have enough research, you know the background history of what's going on in the place, and you know a lot of the culture, and you're asking questions where you can, trying to figure things out. You're able to understand quite a lot of things from direct observation. And the more, I think on some level, the more important part of the question, like an interpreter is a logistical question. You need to find an interpreter, right? Like, and that's the problem that you can solve. The harder problem, I think, is to go into a place with as few biases as you can. And that is the harder part of it, because when you go in with your biases really powerful, and don't recognize them and are not searching for new insight, then what happens is no matter, even if you have an interpreter, what they're telling you is a falling on a brain that is going to hear things differently. You have to do your best to let go of the things that you think you know. And that, in some ways, I think is maybe the harder part of that equation, which is to, yes, you want an interpreter, you're listening to them, you're shaping it, but every time you listen to them, you listen to other people speak, you're trying your best to not just interpret what it is they're saying, but you're trying to find your internal resistance to the things that people are saying and let those things go.
Definitely. And so just looking at the time, I think we'll have to wrap up this discussion on that note. But thank you all so much. These are such powerful stories, but they're also necessary. And I hope that we'll all feel moved to see more clearly, feel more deeply, and empower us to take action. And I'll turn it over. Glenn, did you want to close things out for us?
Well, I'd just like to thank our presenters today. Thank you, Justin. Each one of you just did an extraordinary job. It was just so great to hear your stories and see your photographs, and on Earth Day. And I think all of you give us hope and courage to keep the struggle up, because you show us how much dedicated work there is being done out there amidst the challenges. So thank you for bringing that to us today. And just really want to thank everybody for being with us today. We have a few more programs left. I hope you can join us for. Information's on our website. And, just keep up the good work, everybody. Keep up the struggle, and thank you. And why doesn't everybody just applaud our speakers? Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, everybody. And thank you all for being here.
And as you know, this is being recorded. It will be on the SDN YouTube channel in a few days. And we'll send out an email to everybody who registered to let them know when it's available. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Nice. All right. Big love, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.